Things have just gotten a whole lot more complicated for Robert Morris. What started as a small issue has spiraled out of control, and now the situation is worse than anyone imagined. With shocking revelations coming to light, the pressure is building. How far will this go, and what does this mean for his future? You won't believe the new details that have just surfaced. Brace yourself, because things are about to get even messier. In 2024, Robert Morris, the former senior pastor of Gateway Church, found himself caught in a whirlwind of legal and financial troubles that no one saw coming. For years, Morris had been a respected figure in the church community, leading one of the largest megachurches in the country. But when he stepped down as the senior pastor, it didn't take long for a series of shocking revelations to surface, throwing his entire career into turmoil. It all started when reports came to light about accusations dating back to 1982. During that time, Morris was traveling as a preacher in Oklahoma, and it was alleged that he had been involved in an incident that hurt a young girl. The accusations were serious, and in early 2024, a grand jury in Oklahoma charged him with 5 serious crimes related to the incident. This news spread quickly, casting a dark shadow over Morris's reputation and leaving the church community in disbelief. But the troubles didn't end there. Along with the criminal charges, Morris was also embroiled in a bitter financial dispute with Gateway Church. He had expected a generous retirement package, which he claimed had been promised to him back in 2014. Morris said that church leaders had verbally agreed to pay him a large sum for his retirement, $1 million, 0 cents up front, followed by $800,000, 0 cents a year until he turned 70. After he reached 70, Morris believed the payments would drop to $600,000, 0 cents annually, continuing until his death, with the same amount going to his wife after his passing. However, Gateway Church denied these claims. They argued that there was no written record of such an agreement, and that Morris's demands were based on verbal promises that couldn't be legally upheld. The church rejected his request for millions in retirement benefits, leading to a heated financial dispute. Morris, in an attempt to keep things private and avoid more public attention, pushed for a process called binding arbitration. This was a way to settle the matter privately, without the public scrutiny of a court trial. But the church disagreed and filed a request to have the matter handled in a regular court, making it clear they didn't want any more secrets. As if the legal and financial battles weren't enough, Morris's personal wealth began to come under scrutiny. Reports revealed that even after stepping down, he continued to live a life of luxury, buying and selling multi-million-dollar properties across Texas. This raised questions about how much wealth Morris had accumulated during his time as a pastor, and whether his lifestyle was in line with the values he preached. His critics pointed out that while church members were donating to support the ministry, Morris was living in mansions and making lucrative real estate deals. The combination of criminal charges, the financial dispute with the church, and the public revelations about his wealth painted a picture of a man who had fallen from grace. His once untouchable status as a preacher and leader was now in jeopardy, and his actions were being scrutinized by both the public and the church community. It was a tough and messy situation, showing just how quickly someone's reputation and career can unravel when faced with legal and financial issues. The financial dispute surrounding Robert Morris took a dark turn when the once respected pastor found himself in a battle for millions of dollars in retirement benefits. What had started as a relatively quiet issue about his future became one of the key points of contention after his sudden resignation from Gateway Church in 2024. It wasn't just about stepping down from the pulpit. This was about the money, a lot of it. The conflict began when Morris, after resigning from his position as senior pastor, set his sights on the retirement package he believed he was owed. According to Morris, back in 2014, there was an agreement between him and church leaders that would secure his financial future. The deal, he said, involved not just a one-time payment, but a continuous flow of funds for the rest of his life, and after his passing, for his wife as well. Morris claimed that this verbal agreement promised him $1 million, 0 cents for his retirement, along with an annual payment of around $800,000, 0 cents until he turned 70. That's a hefty sum by anyone's standards, but Morris believed that the church had committed to it. Once he reached the age of 70, he argued that the payments would be reduced to $600,000, 0 cents a year, and even after his death, the church would continue paying that amount to his wife, Debbie. To some, this might sound like an unusually large retirement package, especially for someone in a ministry role. But Morris was not just any pastor. He had led Gateway Church, one of the largest megachurches in the country, and had a huge influence on its growth and success. His teaching had attracted thousands, and with that came significant financial resources. It was perhaps not surprising that the church would have made such promises. But what was surprising was how the church later denied they ever existed. Gateway Church, on the other hand, strongly disagreed with Morris's version of events. The church's leadership rejected the idea that Morris was entitled to such a large sum of money, arguing that there was no written proof of any agreement being made. In fact, they stated that the financial promises Morris claimed were made during private meetings with church leaders were simply not backed up by any official document. The church maintained that while verbal promises may have been made, they could not be legally binding without being properly documented in writing. The church's position was clear. No written agreement meant no obligation to pay Morris the millions he was now demanding. This was a major sticking point for Morris, as it meant that he could not rely on the church to fulfill what he considered to be a commitment made to him. The financial dispute had become a public spectacle, with both sides refusing to back down, and the public nature of the conflict only added fuel to the fire. Morris, likely frustrated by the church's refusal to honor the alleged agreement, pushed for a method of resolution known as binding arbitration. This process is often used in legal disputes as a way to settle matters privately and more efficiently than through the court system. In arbitration, both parties agree to have a neutral third party, known as an arbitrator, listen to their case and make a binding decision. The process is typically faster, less formal, and, most importantly, private. For Morris, binding arbitration seemed like a logical choice. Given that he was already facing a public legal battle over the criminal charges against him, it's easy to see why he might want to keep the financial dispute out of the public eye. Arbitration would allow the matter to be settled behind closed doors, away from the press and public scrutiny. It would also allow him to avoid a drawn-out court process, which could expose even more details about his financial dealing. However, Gateway Church was not interested in arbitration. They strongly opposed the idea and filed a request with the court to block Morris from forcing the matter into private arbitration. The church wanted the financial dispute to be handled in open court, where all the details could be examined by a judge and a jury. They felt that the stakes were too high, and the potential for miscommunication or misunderstanding was too great to be handled outside the public eye. The church's refusal to go along with arbitration showed just how serious the situation had become. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was about transparency, trust, and control. The church wanted clarity and wanted to ensure that any money paid to Morris, especially in the wake of his criminal charges, was justified and documented. In their view, the matter was too important to be dealt with in private. They wanted the facts to be fully explored, and they believed that a court trial would give them the best chance of doing that. Morris's demands were hard to ignore, though. The sums of money involved were staggering. Even if the church were to settle with Morris for just the $1 million, 0 cents up front, and an annual payment of $800,000, 0 cents, for several more years, it would still amount to millions of dollars in total. And after Morris turned 70, the payments were supposed to continue to Debbie, his wife, at a rate of $600,000, 0 cents per year. Over the years, this could add up to an enormous amount of money, all funded by donations from churchgoers who had given to support the ministry, not to line the pockets of the church's leadership. This is where the financial aspect of the situation became controversial. For many churchgoers, the idea of such a large payout to a pastor, especially one who had stepped down under a cloud of scandal, seemed deeply unfair. Many of the people who donated to Gateway Church were struggling financially themselves. They had given their money with the belief that it would go towards serving the community, helping the needy, and spreading the gospel. The idea that millions of dollars were being set aside for a pastor's retirement raised serious questions about the role of wealth in church leadership. At the heart of the dispute was more than just the money. It was about trust. Trust between Morris and Gateway Church, trust between the church and its members, and trust in the integrity of the leadership itself. As the situation played out, the public was left questioning whether the church had truly been transparent about its financial dealings, and whether Morris was more focused on securing his own financial future than serving the people who had supported him for years. When Robert Morris stepped down as the senior pastor of Gateway Church in 2024, it was not just the end of an era for the church, it was the beginning of a new, tumultuous chapter. Gateway Church, one of the largest and most influential megachurches in the country, was suddenly thrust into a situation that no one had expected. The fallout from Morris's resignation wasn't limited to him alone. The entire church began to feel the weight of the consequences, and it wasn't long before the church's reputation was on the line. Gateway Church had always prided itself on being a beacon of faith, hope, and community. It had built its name on the idea of being a place where people could find spiritual guidance and support. But with the criminal charges against Morris, the financial disputes over his retirement, and the scandals surrounding his personal wealth, that image began to crack. What had once been a shining example of a thriving, purpose-driven church now found itself fighting to maintain its credibility. The allegations against Morris were serious enough to raise eyebrows. The charges stemming from an incident in 1982 were deeply troubling, and the fact that they had resurfaced so many years later made the situation even more complicated. Suddenly, the church, which had been a place of worship and spiritual growth for thousands, became the subject of public scrutiny. People began to wonder, how could such an influential leader, someone who had guided so many, fall so far? And more importantly, what did this mean for the church he had helped build? As the criminal charges began to unfold, the church's leadership found themselves in an incredibly difficult position. It wasn't just about managing the crisis, it was about protecting the church's integrity. Gateway Church had thousands of members who had supported the ministry for years, many of whom had given their money, time, and energy to help build the church into what it had become. Now, with the accusations against Morris, those very people were questioning everything. They wanted answers, they needed reassurance, and, more than anything, they wanted to know if the church's values had been compromised. The financial dispute added another layer of complexity. Morris's request for millions of dollars in retirement benefits was not just a matter of money, it was a matter of trust. Gateway Church had always emphasized transparency and integrity, but now, with the details of the financial disagreements spilling into the public eye, it seemed as though those principles were being called into question. The church was forced to defend its stance, stating that there was no written record of the promises Morris claimed were made to him. The church's leaders maintained that Morris's demands were unreasonable and that they could not honor them without proper documentation. For the congregation, this was more than just a legal battle. It was a matter of ethics and moral responsibility. Many of the church members who had supported Morris through the years felt conflicted. On one hand, they had trusted him, they had believed in his leadership and his message. On the other hand, they were now faced with a situation that felt like a betrayal. They wanted to support the church, but they couldn't ignore the growing concerns about the way things were being handled. The church leadership had to work hard to reassure its members that they were still committed to the principles that had always defined Gateway. They had to distance themselves from the personal issues of Morris and make it clear that the church was more than just one person. But the damage to the church's reputation was already done. Trust had been shaken, and for many, once trust is broken, it's hard to rebuild. Gateway Church's image as a place of humility and service had been replaced by a narrative of greed, scandal, and dishonesty. The public perception was no longer about faith and community. It was about wealth, power, and the abuse of both. The revelations about Morris's wealth, including his purchase and sale of multi-million-dollar properties, only served to fuel the fire. Morris, who had once preached about the importance of generosity and serving others, was now being criticized for his extravagant lifestyle. People began to question how a pastor could amass such wealth while encouraging his congregation to donate money, often with the promise of blessings in return. The church's leadership had to grapple with the fact that their former leaders' actions were reflecting poorly on them. The negative press and the growing public outrage made it harder to keep up the appearance of a church that was focused on serving the community. Instead, Gateway Church was being painted as just another institution where wealth and power were prioritized over humility and service. One of the most challenging aspects of the situation was the ongoing legal battle. With Morris's refusal to back down on his retirement benefits, the church found itself in the uncomfortable position of defending its financial decisions in court. While the church was trying to maintain its image as a place of spiritual guidance, the headlines were filled with stories of legal disputes and financial greed. Every new development, every new piece of information that came to light made it harder for the church to move past the scandal and focus on its mission. As the weeks and months passed, Gateway Church's reputation continued to suffer. Members who had once been proud to attend services there began to question their loyalty. Some left the church altogether, feeling disillusioned by what had transpired. Others remained, but their faith in the leadership had been shaken. For the church to regain its credibility, it would need to do more than just address the legal and financial issues. It would need to rebuild the trust that had been lost, not just with the public, but with its own congregation. This scandal was a wake-up call for the church, and for many others in the religious community. It served as a reminder of how easily things could go wrong when trust, integrity, and accountability were compromised. For Gateway Church, it was a painful journey, one that would require a lot of work to repair. But the real question remained: would the church ever be able to fully restore its reputation? Or had the damage been done beyond repair? The saga of Robert Morris and his legal and financial troubles raises deeper, more uncomfortable questions about the relationship between ministry and wealth. For many, the story isn't just about a fallen pastor or a megachurch in crisis. It's about the wider issue of how wealth and faith intersect in today's world. When a person dedicates their life to the service of others, when they speak of humility, service, and giving, how can they reconcile those ideals with the immense wealth that some church leaders accumulate? Robert Morris, a man who once stood as a symbol of success in the Christian ministry world, now finds himself at the center of a scandal that makes many question the authenticity of ministry in the age of megachurches and lavish lifestyles. This isn't just a story of one pastor's fall from grace. It's a reflection of the broader tension that many are feeling today about the role of wealth in the modern church. It all started with Morris's role as senior pastor at Gateway Church, one of the largest and most influential churches in the country. Like many other megachurch pastors, Morris enjoyed immense influence. His sermons reached thousands of people, his teachings shaped the lives of countless believers, and his church became a hub for community outreach, ministry, and worship. But with all this success came something more complicated: the accumulation of wealth. Morris was known for living a luxurious lifestyle. From multi-million-dollar properties to expensive cars, his personal wealth became a topic of discussion among both his critics and supporters. The more Morris prospered, the more questions arose about the disconnect between the humble messages he preached and the extravagant life he seemed to be living. How could a pastor who spoke of the importance of giving and living simply amass such wealth? Was he still living by the values he preached, or had the accumulation of wealth become the true focus of his ministry? For many, the answer seemed unclear. There is no doubt that Morris built something extraordinary at Gateway Church. The church was a place where people felt inspired, where lives were changed, and where many found hope and a sense of belonging. But as Morris's wealth grew, so did the scrutiny. How could someone who lived in multi-million-dollar homes, bought expensive properties, and enjoyed a life of luxury claim to be living according to the teachings of Jesus, who spoke often about the dangers of wealth? The Bible itself offers guidance on this topic, but it's complicated. On one hand, there are passages that suggest wealth is not inherently evil. After all, King Solomon, one of the most revered figures in the Bible, was incredibly wealthy. There's also the parable of the talents, where Jesus teaches that those who manage their resources wisely are rewarded. So on one level, it's not necessarily wrong for someone in ministry to be wealthy, if it is done righteously and with integrity. But at the same time, there are numerous warnings throughout Scripture about the dangers of wealth. Jesus warned about the love of money and how it can become a snare that leads people away from true faith. He spoke about how it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. These verses don't just apply to the world at large. They apply to church leaders as well. When a pastor becomes wealthy, it raises legitimate questions about their priorities. Are they truly focused on serving others, or are they more focused on building a financial empire? Are they using their wealth to further the kingdom of God, or are they using their position to increase their personal wealth and influence? For Morris, the reality of his wealth became impossible to ignore. Reports surfaced that he had bought and sold several luxury homes in Texas, with some valued at $8 million, 0 cents. His properties included expansive ranches, lakeside homes, and estates in some of the wealthiest areas of the state. While it's not unusual for someone with significant wealth to own multiple properties, the contrast between Morris's lavish lifestyle and the message he had preached for years was striking. To many, it seemed that the wealth he accumulated during his time as pastor of a megachurch came at the expense of the very people he was supposed to serve. The fact that many churchgoers were struggling to make ends meet while their pastor lived in opulence only made the situation more uncomfortable. People began to question whether the money they gave to the church, money they believed was being used for ministry and outreach, was being used to fund a lifestyle that didn't seem to align with the values the church claimed to uphold. It raised important questions about the financial transparency of the church and the way wealth was managed within the ministry. For many of Morris's critics, this wasn't just a matter of money, it was a matter of integrity. In a time when church attendance and donations were at an all-time high, it seemed wrong that so much money was being poured into the pockets of church leaders instead of the community or the causes the church claimed to support. After all, Jesus' ministry wasn't built on wealth. He walked the earth with no home of his own, relying on the generosity of others. His disciples, too, lived humbly and focused on spreading the gospel, not accumulating wealth. The growing tension between ministry and wealth was further highlighted by the legal and financial battles that followed Morris's resignation. His request for millions in retirement benefits, including a $1 million 0 cents payment and annual payments totaling over $800,000 0 cents, was seen by many as excessive, especially in light of his already significant wealth. While Morris defended his claim, arguing that verbal agreements made with church leaders in 2014 had promised him these benefits, the church fought back, insisting that such promises were not legally binding. The disagreement over this sum of money only added to the public's sense that the priorities of the church, and Morris himself, were misaligned with the values they preached. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about what it represented. The growing wealth of church leaders, particularly in the megachurch movement, had begun to overshadow the central message of faith, humility, and service. For many, it seemed as though the church was no longer about serving the poor or helping the community, but rather about securing wealth for those in charge. The spotlight, once focused on faith and service, was now on personal financial gain, and the public's trust in church leadership began to erode. As the situation with Robert Morris unfolded, it served as a stark reminder of the dangers of wealth in ministry. Ministry is meant to be about serving others, not accumulating personal wealth. When leaders forget that, they risk damaging the very foundation of the church. In the end, it's about faithfulness to the calling, humility, and a commitment to the values that Jesus taught, not the accumulation of riches or a life of luxury. The story of Robert Morris isn't just a cautionary tale about one man's fall from grace. It's a broader reflection on the role of wealth in modern ministry and the responsibility that comes with being a spiritual leader. It's a reminder that when ministry is about anything other than serving others and honoring God, it's easy to lose sight of what truly matters.